Hi class, and welcome to the first asynchronous lecture for social psychology. Today we're going to be covering both chapters 1 and 2. Please note that this is the only time that we're actually going to cover two chapters at once. So most of what we'll go over, especially regarding things in chapter 2, a lot of research methods, should be some pretty well-known stuff to you by this point, but do keep an eye on that because it is going to be something that's going to inform a lot of what we talk about for the rest of the semester. With that in mind, a couple quick announcements for you. As a reminder that you are expected to complete the quiz before our next synchronous class session. So if you're taking class on Thursday, make sure you have that quiz complete before you come into class on Thursday. If you're completing classes on Tuesday in person, make sure it's done it's done before that in-person class on Tuesday. If you have any questions, the last question on the quiz is an ungraded question where I'm going to ask you to put any questions you might have so I can always answer them. Additionally, you can contact me by email, stop by office hours, which will be virtual on Zoom. I'll go ahead and throw a link to that into Blackboard, and that is going to be on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 11:30 to 12:30. Another quick note that might be helpful is if I am going too slow or you would like to get through these lectures a little bit quicker, what you can do is you can click on the cog button down on YouTube and actually set the speed to be a little bit faster. Some of you may have already known this, some of you may not have, but this might be a way to make this a little bit easier on you. I know I usually watch videos on 1.5 times speed, so hopefully that's a little bit helpful, but as we move on, where are we going? Some of this may be familiar to class, as we might have talked about some of this, but a lot of this will be new content that will be covered in the book, and we'll be also going over some of this in more detail and discussing this in class for the synchronous session, so please keep that in mind. So first, we're going to talk today about what is social psychology. So what is it that sets it apart from other branches of psychology? We're going to talk about where it came from and some of the history behind social psychology. And lastly, we're going to talk about how social psychologists answer questions. And that's going to be mostly our chapter 2 stuff regarding research methods. But let's start out with what is social psychology. So social psychology is the scientific study of how people, right, humans' thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, so these kind of mental aspects plus this behavioral aspect, which has to do something with the mental aspect, is influenced by others. And it's not just that there are people there. It's not just there are like others present. It's that these are actual present others, imagined or implied. So a big part of this is the fact that we're not always being watched. However, if we even think maybe we're being watched, that might influence our behavior. And I really like how the book talks about Kurt Lewin, who we'll speak about in a minute. They talk about how he, as a physicist, saw all of the different forces, such as gravity, friction, and things like that, had some kind of outcome on how an object either moved or stayed still and what have you. And in reality, we operate in a very similar way. There are forces that maybe we're not paying attention to, social forces that are influencing our behavior. Are we moving to the side of the hall because everybody else is? Are we deciding to disclose or not disclose certain information about ourselves because of the situation we're in and the people we're with? And all of this comes back to the fact that mainly we as humans aren't just reliant on what's going on inside us for our decision making, but also the situation, and as we talk about the analysis of an individual in the context of a situation. So how we take both ourselves in that situation and combine it. And if you think about what social psychology is, it's not just common sense, right? Common sense is logical, right? It makes sense, should, but not empirical. As we know from class, if you think it's common sense, there's a chance you could very well be wrong because you just don't know. It's different from personality psychology because where personality psychology is really just focused on the person, their traits, and how people are consistent over time, we're focused on how situational factors change those things. if my personality happens to be very extroverted, right? I'm very loud and gregarious and I have a lot of friends around, I'm probably not going to act that same way at a funeral. And that is a situational factor which influences how I act. Social psychology is different than cognitive psychology, although I am a social cognitive psychologist, because cognitive psychology mainly studies things like reading, language acquisition, etc. So kind of the building blocks of our brain and how we think, and a lot less focused on situational factors. However, what I study is a social cognitive thing, these if only or counterfactual thoughts, which we'll talk more about later. And the last one, sociology is kind of what I would say one point where psychology is another endpoint, and social psychology is kind of in the middle of those two, where most of psychology is focused on an individual. Social psychology, we're starting to talk about other people, right? Anthropology is talking about mainly cultural or larger, right, societal issues, and that's kind of what sets us apart. Is while we are looking at maybe groups of people or how people interact, we're doing it on a person-to-person basis, not kind of a society level or a cultural level. So we tend to focus more on that individual behavior, whereas other people, in this case, social psychologists, sociologists and anthropologists might go ahead and look at this in a more broad context. I also want to say real fast that I forgot to mention at the beginning, if I make a mistake and I'm going to try to catch these, if something sounds really wrong, do let me know. I'm a bit of a perfectionist, and one of the things I had to give up was making these lectures perfect, in the same way that when I speak in person, my lectures aren't perfect. If I were to record perfect lectures, I would spend probably 20 hours on each lecture. So these are pretty much done in one take, minus a couple cuts where I might pause the video to take a sip of water. So please do recognize if there are any issues or anything like that. Either if it's not that big of a deal and you know the answer, you can let it slide. But if it is something that seems very wrong, contact me or mention it in class. Definitely remember to put that in the front next time. Sorry about that. But so we know that social psychology is not necessarily focused on, right, just individuals or just culture or, you know, how we work or who the person is. Well, Kurt Lewin, who's the father of social psychology, came up with a formula, and he considered this formula to be B is the function of P and E. And what he means by that is a person's behavior is the function of that person themselves, right, and all that goes with that, right, their memories, their personality, etc., and the environment they're in, right? And this comes back to the fact that the situation is very important. Like I mentioned in class, or hopefully I mentioned in class, right, your person and your personality and who you are, all your memories and everything that goes along with being you, tells us a lot about what you might do. But that's not always true, right? So if I am somebody, again, who's very loud, or I think the other example I use is I like to think of myself as a very kind individual, somebody who's not necessarily, right, the most aggressive, right, probably not going to pick a fight if I don't need to, but if I were to need to pick a fight or need to defend myself, I might change how I typically act, right? My behavior might shift a little bit more towards the environment and the situation I'm in. So throughout this class, what I'm hoping is that you're going to find that a lot of things that we tend to think are people's actions are primarily driven by their traits and who they are, actually isn't always true. And we're going to spend some good time talking about that when we talk about the fundamental attribution error. And so, as we kind of already talked about, isn't social psychology just common sense? No. People really think they knew it all along, and we call that hindsight bias. And you may have seen something like this in your own life. For instance, have you ever gotten an answer wrong on an exam and then go, oh, I knew that wasn't the right answer. Why did I put that? Well, if you knew it wasn't the right answer, then you shouldn't have chosen it. And that's what we think of as hindsight bias. And this is a really cool social psychological finding, and one I like to highlight at the beginning because it's really fun to call your friends out on something like that. So What is social psychology? Well, it is the study of humans and the environment and how we interact with that and how we interact with other individuals. But where did it come from? Well, let's start out way back in 1898. So we're going to talk about two studies that are some of the earliest, what we would consider like precursors to social psychology. So in 1898, a guy named Triplett conducted a study, and he also had another individual not too long after called Ringelmann, who conducted a different study in 1913. And what we find here is some really interesting stuff. So with Triplett's study, what he was looking at was how bikers and cyclists, how well they work either alone or as a group. So what he did was he measured the, I think he gave it, right, more or less, he asked individuals to bike a mile, and he checked how long it took those individuals to bike a mile. And he also brought individuals in groups of 3 people. So he had one group of individuals biking alone while the other individuals were biking as part of a group. And what he found was that if you're biking as part of a group, you tend to bike faster than if you bike alone, which is a very interesting finding. We might suggest something like that people who are in our group are pushing us to go faster and do more. So, right, we see that people's behavior is changed as a function of the presence of others. However, in 1913, Ringelmann, another precursor to social psychologists, was looking at how individuals performed in a tug-of-war task. And in a series of experiments, Ringelmann actually found that individuals working alone pulled harder on average than people working in a group. So this is really interesting, right? Because we now have one set of findings that say, hey, people work better in a group than alone. And we have another set of findings that say that people work better alone than in a group. And these are piecemeal findings that aren't necessarily part of a theory. And the reason for the discrepancy between these two studies wasn't understood for a very long time, but because these two studies weren't part of a single theory, they were just considered two separate studies with disparate findings. So now while we go through, I thought I'd also briefly highlight the fact that the contemporary psychological theories that prevailed at this time was Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis. So when these two studies were being published, psychoanalysis was in its heyday. In the psychoanalytic theory, so Freud's theory was really focused on how unconscious conflicts or unconscious thoughts really affected how human behavior, how we thought about life, and this is all that id, ego, superego stuff, and really recognizing the fact that these two studies were pretty much some of the only what we would consider social psychological studies back in the day. There was research being done, but it was clearly the minority, and many people were more on board with that more therapeutic psychoanalytic style. But it wasn't until the 1930s that we see a huge impact. You can imagine there were some major world events between the 1930s and the 1950s, right? Primarily World War II. Now, Kurt Lewin actually was a refugee during World War II. He moved to America and started teaching at I want to say it's either Iowa State or University of Iowa. It was somewhere in Iowa before moving to MIT eventually. And really what Kurt Lewin was interested in understanding was, how do we understand the world? Why are these things that are going on in Nazi Germany happening? And some of the things he was interested in were things like attitudes and persuasion. We saw in less than 20 years an extreme shift towards a very anti-Semitic sentiment towards Jewish individuals in especially Germany, but across Europe. How is this happening? How are people being persuaded to do this? We also see things like stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. We saw a massive and systematic collection and annihilation of right, a large number of Jewish individuals as well as other individuals who were considered less than, right, pure, right. This included the Gypsies or the Roma, homosexuals, eventually got to the point where they were rounding up academics, oh boy, and things like that. But what was it that made people have these stereotypes or show this prejudice or this discrimination? Additionally, how is it that we had this incredible obedience to authority? Many Nazis who committed these atrocities were just normal, everyday people. They weren't necessarily individuals who were pro-Nazi party. Remember, the Nazis only got 30% of the votes. It wasn't everyone who did that. So why is it that people were obeying these commands that were horrible? And then lastly, we can talk about conformity, where we can think like, how is it that well-adjusted and normal people will conform to groups and say things that aren't true or believe things that aren't true? And so this is, you may have heard of the Asch conformity experiment. So which of these lines is the same size? Right, it's clearly B, but what if I told you I can very likely make you choose a different answer? When you can clearly see the right answer here, it's very interesting. At this time, behaviorism is still very dominant, right? We are still starting to understand this idea of behaviorism, so operant conditioning, classical conditioning, really thinking about those rewards and punishments and how people are choosing to behave. So a lot of social psychology here is not exactly focused on that behaviorism. It's more focused on what's going on mentally inside the head, not what people are actually behaving, how they're behaving or what they're doing. But we do see a lot of stuff regarding this. So moving on to the 1960s and 70s, social psychology gets a very bad rap for good reason, for some of the things that they have done in the past. Social psychologists have done some pretty unethical experiments, and really this is interesting because we're still trying as social psychologists at this point to understand what is making people do this. So a lot of what social psychologists would do is try to make these real life scenarios or as close to it as you can. So this is where we see things like the Zimbardo prison experiment or the Stanford prison experiment, and Milgram's famous study on obedience. And so what individuals were really looking at here is what can we learn from these not so real life lab experiments? Maybe some, maybe other things. So why don't we go out in the world and do these big experiments? Well, that can lead to some problems. So really, if you think about this, and as we'll talk about in a minute or towards the end of this lecture, right, we're trying to walk this balance as social psychologists between purely lab studies, which may or may not replicate in the real world, right, external validity, versus these experiments which are happening in the real world that maybe we don't have as much control over, maybe we're not exactly sure. It's just the variables that we're talking about. And at this point, somebody that you may know or may know of his studies, Walter Mischel, this man here, he came out saying that there is no such thing as personality and that it's just the situation that matters. You might know Walter Mischel because he is the creator of the famous marshmallow study, in which they measured students' willpower, especially young kids, asking them to take a marshmallow or have a marshmallow set in front of them and choose to either eat it now or wait 10 minutes and get a second marshmallow. And so there's a lot of stuff regarding this that I think is really great, because Walter Mischel here is really suggesting some interesting things because, well, if you want to be honest, right, you all come into class, you all pay attention, hopefully you all listen, hopefully, and right, raise your hand when you're supposed to, you do what you're supposed to. You dress differently, you all show up and you listen. How much of your personality are you really showing there when you're just kind of following the rules? And this is a very good question to ask, and kind of why Walter Mischel came up with this extreme position was a little bit of a pushback against behaviorism, saying, no, there is definitely some things that do matter other than this. In the 1970s, we're getting a lot more close to what we do now. And so between the 1970s and 1990s, we had the cognitive revolution. So moving away from behaviorism and now starting to focus on the modern era. So thinking, how does the mind work? And in a lot of ways, we often think about the mind working similar to a computer, right? So some of the questions that social psychologists were asking here, right, not more social cognitive psychologists, are, do we process social information the same way as other information, right? How does the situation influence how we process information? And this was really going a shift from real life, so some of those unethical experiments, to more understanding how information is processed. And I like to put up this, but did we lose our way? Because if you think about it, as social psychologists, what we need to do is recognize that part of what we're doing is to understand and hopefully predict behavior that people do. And so if we're using real life studies, we might be getting better data and understanding things a little better than if I'm just looking at this in a lab. So a lot of what we're going to talk about throughout this class and hopefully throughout your time at Stetson is going to be, how do I design a good ethical experiment? That is, if you're a psych major. I do apologize for those of you who aren't, but I still think it's a good question. Another big thing here is that when we were during this time being really focused on things like that information processing, a lot of social psychologists were ignoring some really human factors, right? Motivation to do things, how our emotions work, how we share emotions, right? And that was going up through the 90s, and you can imagine how that's had an impact as well. So there is a ton of interesting stuff regarding this kind of shift towards more of a cognitive thing, but now we get into the modern era of social psychology, and this is also, right, we might still be looking at the influences of social information processing, but we like to think we're doing it in an even-handed way. There's a lot of other areas that we do, not just this social information processing, but we include things like cognitive psychology. We look at motivation and emotion, bringing in neuroscience here to understand maybe what parts of the brain are being used when we access social information. Looking at personality, we can think about how personality or the person and the situation both matter. So what is it that makes some people more likely to do these things than others? We have evolutionary principles, right? So how is it that we've evolved to be social creatures, and cultural variations, which will be a theme throughout this course. Why is it that some cultures act differently than others in similar situations? Why is it that some areas of the United States maybe are a lot more prone to not wearing masks and being more individualistic, whereas other areas of the United States or other cultures, for instance, Japan, has no problem wearing masks in public, right? That's a really good question, especially nowadays. But when you think about this, these are some of the major themes that we will repeatedly frame when we are discussing social psychology. And the important thing to recognize is Lewin's equation has really stood the test of time here, and that we still believe that behavior is this function of the person and the environment, or the person and the situation, depending on what you want to say. So that's the brief history of social psychology, It's not an entirely well ingrained and understood aspect of the world, but it is something to keep in mind, and I think is very useful, Because we have moved through a lot of different perspectives, and we're coming to one that seems to be pretty even-handed, but 30 years from now, that might be totally different. So moving on to how social psychologists answer questions, this is going to be more focused on Chapter 2. So a lot of you should hopefully be familiar with a lot of this. This should just be a quick review, which is good for everybody involved, So how do we answer these questions? Well, we're going to first talk about describing behavior. We're going to talk about how we can predict behavior, how we explain behavior, and then some of the sound research methods that we might use. So first of all, let's just break it down to the most basic thing. And one of the funniest, I might say, that my dad has ever said to me is after I showed him some of the research I was doing, he said, "Wow, son, it's like you're a scientist." I am a scientist, Dad. What I do is science. I do science on people. And we use the scientific method, right? So what's the scientific method? Well, we have a question. This question leads to a hypothesis, which is, right, either an educated guess, which we mostly learned, or a specific statement about what should occur. So that specific statement might be something along the lines of, why do people yawn when they see somebody else yawn? Hopefully I'm not causing you all to yawn, but right, that's a good question. We still don't know the answer to it, right? So we might have a hypothesis about this, a specific statement about what should occur. Well, if we think like from a social evolutionary standpoint, maybe it's the case where we are signaling to others what we are feeling, and maybe that's also helping us to understand that it is time as a group to begin to go to bed, right? And so what we can do is we can do some research and analysis on this stuff. So we can go ahead and either look up other studies, we can, right, see why. I don't know really how you'd study that. We can do some testing regarding that, which should help us understand a theory about maybe why we yawn. So a hypothetical account of how and why this phenomena occurs. And when we get that basic theory down, what we can do is we can start to probe more at that theory and understand it a little better. So starting to kind of complete this circle of where we're now going to go back into it and begin to learn again, are using our own educated guesses and better understand that theory. So, right, we perceive a question, we form a hypothesis, we test it, we draw some conclusions which lead to a theory, and then hopefully that theory is going to lead to more hypotheses. So, some of the ways that we can actually engage in the scientific method as social psychologists, the first one we would just say is kind of just describing behavior, right? So, and this would be a naturalistic observation or an ethnography study. And so these are kind of studies where you might observe behavior where it typically happens. So if you're interested in understanding how people are dealing with social distancing, you might go sit in I clearly haven't been here long enough. The center of campus, I don't know if that quad has a specific name, and you might sit there and kind of just pay attention to people who are walking by each other in different ways. Are they making an effort to go out of the way and really maintain that 6 feet? Are they not? And that's one of those questions that, you don't necessarily need to bring people into a lab to study this. We can just go outside and see what they're doing. And one of the questions we can ask about this are, do you want to just observe what people are doing, or do you want to participate? And one of the most interesting studies, in my opinion, was done by a man named Leon Festinger, who decided to join a cult called the Seekers. They believed that the world would end in a great flood on December 21st, 1956. But since we're all here today, it goes without saying that flood did not happen. So Leon Festinger kind of thought, this is going to be good. I'm going to join this cult, and I'm going to just kind of hang out, and I'm going to see what happens when the flood doesn't come and the spaceship that was supposed to rescue them doesn't come. That is exactly what they believed. They were called the Seekers, if you want to go look it up. So how would you get access to that otherwise? Well, you really can't. So part of it might be participating. But now we come back to that question of, is this ethical? Maybe, maybe not. So that's its own thing. And then we can also talk about how we are getting down to this, external validity, right? So we can say for some of our studies, for instance, in the people walking away, or the social distancing study I just was talking about, right? Hopefully that can be generalized to the rest of the world, but maybe we need to go other places than just Stetson's quad. But we might not fall into I should have put this up here. So these are high in external validity, and so it can be generalized outside the study because, hopefully that data is real life data, and we're seeing what people actually do in a realistic setting. However, some limitations is we can only describe things. I have no private or rare events here. Right, like Leon Festinger was able to join this cult and have that as part of part of his experiment, but generally, right, it's harder to get access to private events. There's also these ideas of self-awareness or demand characteristics, right? If you know you're being watched, you're going to change your behavior, right? If you are if for some reason, because nobody would ever cheat, a professor was staring at you while you were taking an exam, even if you're not cheating, you're probably going to start acting a little bit different, making sure you're not looking like you're cheating. If you're driving down the road, and even if you're going the speed limit and see a cop, you might hit your brakes. And we call those demand characteristics or just self-awareness, because you are understanding that somebody's watching you. And like we said, social psychology, you don't even have to have somebody actually watching you. The perception that somebody might be watching you is enough to maybe change how you act. We can also talk about the observer bias and double-blind experiments. Is it the case where, I have this theory or this hypothesis and I really want it to work, and maybe either because I am a terrible researcher, I say things that aren't true, or maybe I just actually subtly misinterpret some information as supporting my theory. So we might use double-blind experiments where those are going to be better. We don't have double-blind experiments here. So recognizing that is a limitation, because we're not sure if our variables are the exact variables that might be causing what we see here. And that also goes in with poor control, because we're not having any control. So again, that low internal validity here. So describing behavior is the most obvious way that we can actually study social psychology, but it's not the only descriptive way that we can do this. At least in my research, bread and butter of what I do is survey research. So we ask people questionnaires based on different scales, based on different questions we have, and we give this to many people. So, for instance, one of my my research, I ask individuals, hey, describe a negative event that's happened in the past year that's especially negative or disappointing, and just write about it for a couple minutes. And then I ask them to think about the if-onlys they have about that situation. So in the following box, please please fill in the blank. So if only I blank, the outcome would have been better. And so this is something that's really useful because, I can get a lot of data very quickly and cheaply, but it's not the only thing, There are some limits. There might be issues with question wording, We actually see in experiments we'll talk about, I think that's intro. In some of the memory research, how we word questions can change our answers. If I have you watch a video on where two cars hit each other, and I ask you how fast those cars were traveling when they hit each other, I can actually make you choose different speeds based on my question wording, right? If I ask you, how fast were the cars going when they bumped into each other? You're probably going to choose a lower speed than if I say, how fast were the cars going when they crashed or smashed into each other? So question wording is also important. We already talked a little about social desirability bias in the sense that maybe we want to choose answers that make us look good, right? So I remember back in high school, there would be kind of like national surveys sent out where we were asked, what kind of drugs you were using, alcohol. And this was like 7th grade. So, some people who are using drugs and alcohol at that age, or in high school, who are getting this survey, they might not want to respond how they actually feel. They might want to respond in a way that they would prefer to sound more socially desirable. No, I've never drank, I've never smoked. And we can see that. And additionally, we can talk about sampling errors with biased or convenience samples. But the one example I want to give about this survey research that kind of explains the whole thing pretty well is Dr. Kinsey down here. So Dr. Kinsey, you may know him from the Kinsey scale, He was one of the first researchers back in the 1950s to study the sexuality in the United States. This is a completely taboo subject back then, You really, nobody really talked about it. And he found some really interesting findings. He came out with his sample and found that 50% of all men cheated on their significant others, 26% of women did, and that 10% of all respondents were homosexual. And so he stated that that's probably about what society is, or in the United States, is that about half of the men cheat, a quarter of the women cheat, and about 10% are homosexual. We know all three of those things to be false. And why do we know all three of those things to be false? Well, because we've done a lot more data and we've done it a lot better. So one issue that he did was, it's similar to question wording, but Kinsey used face-to-face interviews with people, which, first of all, people aren't exactly as honest, which kind of scares me regarding the 50% of men and 26% of women cheating. But right, that's going to lead to more of a social desirability bias, right? If your doctor, you've seen those jokes, it's like, how would you respond if you were asked in a doctor's office, are you sexually active and your parent is in the room? You might answer differently than if the parent isn't in the room. But the reason Kinsey found these results that were so wrong was that he actually oversampled Indiana prisons. So he took all of his sampling from prisoners, which are probably not exactly the same as the general population. It's not that they're not, but they might have different characteristics. So when we do survey research, you've got to be very careful that you're getting, right, samples that are good and samples that are focused on kind of what we expect, right? If you find something like this, it's probably good to go and repeat that study somewhere else to make sure you didn't pull a sample that's right, maybe not representative. So we can describe behavior, but as psychologists, we also want to predict behavior. And one of the most important ways that we predict behavior is using correlational studies. Correlational studies are the kind of halfway point between halfway point between an experimental study and a descriptive study, right? So correlational studies determine how much and in which way two pre-existing variables are related. So the strengths of this are that, right, we can study things we can't or shouldn't manipulate. If I want to study height and gender, right, I cannot actually say, you're a boy, you're a girl, you're a boy, you're a girl, right, at birth, and then find out how tall they end up when they're, say, 25. I can't do that. That's something that's just literally impossible, right? You also shouldn't, right, make some people smoke and other people not smoke in order to test whether people, right, smoking causes lung cancer. So with this, what we can do, though, is take data that we already have. We know, right, how tall people are. We also often have access to a lot of that demographic information. Things like smoking and risk of lung cancer, we can see right from people's charts who might offer or right, give us that information. We can see, right, is there a higher percentage of people who smoke that do get lung cancer or not. So it's really great because it's there. We can get a lot of data. It's pretty cheap and easy, and we are able to look at these variables that maybe we can't actually change. But of course, there are some limitations, right? There's the response bias. So again, people maybe aren't listening. There's sampling errors, and we cannot exactly interpret causality. So this second picture down here, right, that Dewey defeats Truman is a great example of why correlational studies aren't exactly great and sampling errors do happen. So this newspaper where President Truman is holding up a newspaper where he apparently lost. The Chicago Daily Tribune said that he lost the election. He did not. So what happened is they happened to oversample people who voted for Dewey, and they, right, assumed incorrectly that Dewey was going to win the election, right? So we know that this is useful, but not always perfect. So we also have different types of correlations, which hopefully you guys know. As just a kind of reminder, we have 3 types: a positive correlation, where increasing one variable increases the other. So as the, in this sample, as the exposure to violent TV increases, the acts of aggression go up. That's not really how it works. We can also have negative correlations, where increasing one decreases the other. And I should say before I move on, for the positive correlation, increasing one may increase the other, but decreasing one can also decrease the other. It's technically the same, it's just flipped. It's like a negative and a negative is a positive if you multiply them. In the same way, we get that. But a negative correlation, right, increasing one variable decreases the other. So maybe, we have the how ill you are on a scale from who knows, right? So maybe you are extremely ill up here versus, right, you've just got the sniffles down here, and how optimistic you are for the future, right? So the more sick you are, the less optimistic you are for the future in this case. But we can see this in other places, right? The more time you spend studying, the less chance you have to fail an exam, right? Might be a way we can think about that as a negative correlation, but we would probably more think about that as time spent studying increases, right, grades or score on an exam increases as well. The other one is the zero correlation or no predictive value. So this is going to be, right, the idea that, crimes here on the y-axis, right, are they at all, related to the phases of the moon from a new moon to a full moon? Right, here the answer is no. The answer in general is no. There is no real kind of idea that lunacy, or the idea that the moon is causing these things to happen, is anything but false. So the important thing to remember, though, is that, right, we cannot assume that correlation equals causation. Hopefully you've had this drilled into your mind by now, right? You can never definitively assume causation from a correlational relationship. We have good evidence to suggest that smoking increases the likelihood you will get lung cancer, right? But we see many people who have never smoked who get lung cancer, and we see people who have smoked their whole life who don't get lung cancer. And so you can't say this is a one is likely or one causes the other, but maybe they're related, right? And some other problems with this include things like reverse causation. So what if, right, you think that married people are more likely to be happy? So you think that, right, maybe as time in a marriage goes up, your happiness increases. Well, is that the only way that this relationship could work, or could it be that as happiness goes up, the chances of you getting married go up? Maybe it's the case that happy people are more likely to get married. It's a completely reasonable assumption, but if you're looking at just the data, you might not know for sure. Additionally, you can have things like reciprocal causation. So is it the case that where helping people is increasing how happy you feel? Or maybe happiness increases how much you'll help? Or maybe it's both, right? That if you help somebody, you tend to be happier, and if you're happy, you tend to be helping. And this might be kind of a feeding cycle where, right, as you do one, the other one also increases, and they both keep increasing. These are still really useful because they give us an idea of what might be causing the relationship to happen, right? We don't know exactly that smoking causes cancer, but we think it might be involved in this, right? So I like this example here because technically you don't know what's under this sheet, but you probably know that it's an elephant, right? It's probably an elephant. In the same way, we don't know that smoking, right, increases your chances of getting cancer, but we're pretty sure it does, even though we can't prove it. So when we predict behavior, especially regarding correlations, we're trying to predict behavior here that maybe we always can't. But we can also explain behavior, and this is one of the biggest things, and we do that through experiments. So we might manipulate one or more factors while controlling for others. So things like the Milgram experiment. There were a lot of different variations of the Milgram experiment. Some of them include delivering the instructions from a different room so that the experimenter wasn't right next to the person giving the shock here. Some other things included, right, actually having the learner or the person being shocked in a different location who couldn't be heard even through an intercom. And what we're doing there is we are only changing one little thing about these different experiments to kind of help us understand what the differences are and if those variables themselves are causing changes. Some strengths of this, right, is that it's high in internal validity, and we can conclude causality. If the only thing we're changing is that one variable between the two conditions, it's pretty easy to say that if we have a large enough sample size, then it's probably that difference. So think about it. If I eat McDonald's every day and I throw up every night, but then all of a sudden I decide to go eat Burger King every day and I stop throwing up, that's probably one way that we can look at this. And we might be able to conclude, right, that McDonald's is causing us to throw up, especially if I switch back to McDonald's for a day, throw up, and then switch back off of it. That's going to help us have high internal validity and this belief that we know what is causing these factors. Some limitations, though, these are expensive, both in terms of time, energy, and sometimes building these experiments. We have demand characteristics, as we mentioned, right? So the experimenter and subject biases that these people might want to either help studies, or they might want to hurt studies. So going back to that example I used earlier regarding the drug surveys that I got back in 7th grade, there were students who would put down that they took ecstasy every day in 7th grade, which hopefully the researchers realized this seems pretty fake to me. But subject biases might happen. You might want to help the experimenter. You might want to hurt the experimenter's results. And so that's why we use as lot of people as as many people as we do. And the last thing here, of course, is the low in external validity, meaning that this is going on inside a room where maybe we don't have all of our all of those kind of outside factors to recognize that this is more of a real life scenario. Because how many times in your life are you really ever put in a room and asked to shock somebody? That's not a very realistic scenario, but it does give us some kind of understanding. So we are scientists as psychologists, and social psychologists have gotten a lot of crap. If you remember reading towards the end of the chapter, there's a large replicability crisis in psychology. Anybody in the medical field, get ready because you're about to have one as well. The idea is that not all of our results are replicating when we try to replicate them. And part of that is, maybe it is demand characteristics, maybe it's characteristics of the situation, maybe the sample wasn't big enough. But it might also be that the experimenters aren't using the right kind of follow-up questions or using the same exact samples that the other experimenters used. And so when we think about this, we really have to dig down into what it means to use the scientific method. And hopefully this is a pretty kind of pretty familiar thing, but let's talk about some basic concepts in the scientific method, including variables, which are factors or characteristics that are manipulated or measured in research, and operational definitions. So while variables are the what, so what are we measuring, what are we doing, the operational definitions are the how. How are we measuring? How are we doing this? So this is a description of the exact methods that will be used to measure a variable. And we can use a lot of different types of these, whether they be self-report, so survey research, behavioral measures. We can ask people, do you prefer a pen or a pencil? And we can see which they choose after experiments, which has been done to great success. Or physiological measures. I can hook you up to different kind of measures. I can hook you up to an eye tracker. I can put something on your finger that measures GSR, or galvanic skin response, how sweaty your fingers get. We can do things like heart rate, breathing, respiratory system. A lot of different kinds of methods that all help us better to understand what exactly we're defining. And that's easy in all for a lot of things when you think about it on the surface level, but the question is, how do you define something like happiness? How do you define something like aggression? How do you define these things? If it's a ruler, if it's how long is something, we just use a measurement, whether that be a ruler, or either using feet and inches, or centimeters and meters. But we're talking about some specific things that maybe are really abstract, right? How do you define hunger or anger or any of these emotions? So quickly with variables, as a reminder, we have two types. We have independent variables, or IVs, and these are the variables that are manipulated by a researcher, and we expect them to cause a change in another variable. So the independent variables are going to be the situation that maybe a group is put into, and we expect this to cause a change in a dependent variable. Our dependent variable is what we are measuring, and it depends on the results of the independent variable. So with experiments, these two key types of variables, where the independent variable is manipulated or controlled by the researcher, maybe an experimental group here, we ask, maybe in this situation we have here, what we do is we make participants listen to their boss yell at them while they're getting angry. And in one group, we have these participants throw a chair at their boss. And in a control group, we have the participants just sit quietly and not say anything to their boss. So this independent variable now has two levels: our experimental group who throw the chair versus our control group who don't do anything other than just sit there. And we can measure that using the dependent variable, the measurement of this. And what would we maybe measure here? Well, we could measure something like happiness. So our question, do people feel happier as a result of chair throwing? Well, how do we measure happiness? Well, we can use a lot of different things, but maybe we want to use a validated scale. We might use a scale like this because when we report what we find, it's pretty easy to see where people fall on this on average. Not only that, but it might have been validated. Other people might use these. And what we can really do with something like this is we can have other people come in and repeat the same experiment as us using the same measures. So that is going to be really useful to allow us to come together as a science and find replicable results that we can replicate. So with experiments, two critical features of experiments, oftentimes, not always, will they have a control variable. So we might manipulate some variables while holding others constant. That doesn't mean you have to have a control variable, We can control other things. We might control the location in which you perform a study. We might control the questions you are given. We might control, whether or not you have your phone with you to distract you. If you've been part of a study, you probably have been told to put away your phone. But we can also have control conditions, like in the last slide. We can have control conditions, meaning a condition where maybe a participant doesn't get any treatment, similar to a placebo group in a medical study. The other important thing is random assignment. So in the same way that I randomly assigned students to be in the Tuesday or Thursday class for this class, what I did was I just took the roster and I basically put a number generator on you guys. I said, give me a 1 or a 2 for each one of you. I eventually had to make it even because it gave me too many 2s and not enough 1s. But what I did then was I flipped a coin and I said, if it's heads is going to be, if it's heads, 1 is Tuesday. If it's tails, 1 is Thursday. And what that is more or less down here, what we might call the great equalizer. Why is it the great equalizer? Because I didn't do it by half of the alphabet, what I did was I gave you all an equal chance of being on either day, unless you were the 1 or 2 students who requested to be on a certain day, in which case I did go ahead and allow that. But you can understand why that's useful if we take a whole population and randomly sample a random amount of people there. Some problems we run into are that we don't always randomly assign correctly. For instance, if I only look at Stetson students for my study, and say I want to look at preference of sporting events, and I only measure Stetson students, my understanding as a new faculty is that Stetson is a big baseball school, whereas I came from Texas A&M, one of the biggest definitely not the best football teams in the country. That was very much a football school. And so if I were to only sample people from Stetson, right, and I might end up getting results that aren't true of everyone, similar to how we saw in Kinsey's research. I did forget to kind of finish discussing operational definitions, but quickly with operational definitions, right, just remember these are a clear and concise and objective definition of a measure. And what we mean by that is they're something that somebody else, another researcher, could come in and use the same measures that we do to understand these. And we'll talk more about that in class coming up. So lastly, let's talk about using sound research methods. So how do we make sure our experiments are good? What's interesting is I received a call from my mom one day, probably a year or two ago, and she has she did not graduate from college, and she just kind of called me up and out of the blue. She goes, "Hey, how do you know people, right? How do you know you're measuring what you think you're measuring, right? Because you're not asking people, right, how long things are. You're not asking how warm things are. In which case you would use, right, a ruler or a thermometer, but how do we know, right, that we're measuring what we think we're measuring?" And I basically said, "That's a great question, Mom. If you would come to one of my lectures, I could probably describe that to you." And this is kind of that lecture, right? So what we need to know is that our measures are both reliable and valid, right? So are our measures accurately measuring what we think they're measuring? Are they accurately keeping track of what we want them to? And are they even measuring what we want them to? So for reliability, right, this is a tendency to produce the same result over and over and over again on a test. Some different experiments we might expect to have high reliability. So we might expect people's grades, throughout their life to usually stay pretty consistent. That doesn't mean they're the same, but pretty consistent, right? So if you hop on a scale 3 times in a row, you're going to hope that it gives you the same number, in which case we would say that scale's reliable. If that scale is giving you different numbers down here, we better hope it starts giving you that lower number more often than not. But what you're going to realize is that's not a reliable scale. You don't want to use that, right? Throw it out. So reliability is just how consistently a test will measure the variable of interest and do it in the same way. So that's very important. But right, what if I had one of these, what if I had this scale actually set to be, right, starting at 5 pounds instead of 0 pounds? It was zeroed in on 5. And so maybe you actually only weigh 145 pounds, but every time you hop on the scale, right, you see 150. Well, we would say that that's not a valid measure. Right? So if the degree that a test accurately measures the variable of interest, if that's not the case, our measure's not valid, and it's also something we don't want to use. Are IQ tests true measures of intelligence? Short answer is absolutely not. Right? We all have different maybe types of intelligence. We might be socially very intelligent. We might be emotionally very intelligent. We might be, right, street smart. We might be book smart. But IQ tests only measure a specific set of things and not everything. So are we actually measuring the variable we're trying to measure? And sometimes you can actually get variables that measure things really well, but they don't make sense. So one of my favorite examples of this is there is on a depression inventory scale, a really good predictor of depression, like a correlation of 0.3, which is pretty good in terms of that type of research, is how you respond to the question, "I like tub baths," which is weird, right? So if you like tub baths, not bathtubs, not baths, tub baths, what we see is we find this kind of this seems to both validly and reliably predict, right, how depressed individuals are. It turns out that the more you tend to like tub baths, and not just that, the more you tend to apparently be depressed. But with validity, right, this is the idea that, right, maybe there's internal validity where the only only independent variable, only our independent variable is influencing our dependent variable, versus external validity, to which the extent these findings generalize to the real world. So with internal validity, imagine that in a study about TV violence, that researchers inadvertently show violent show to a class that it's almost all boys, and then a nonviolent show to a class that is almost all girls. In this scenario, we probably couldn't be confident that the only independent variable being what the students watched is going to predict our DV on how aggressive or violent these individuals are. So we might think that maybe it might also be gender, because we are not sure about that. So the solution to that is making sure we are randomly sampling very well, and that we are getting about equal levels across the population, or across our sample. Some examples of external validity, though. If we're going to measure the effects of stress on sleep, for instance, we might post flyers around town to try to get a diverse sample for the study. We might get about 15 people in the study and find that stress does not affect the quality of sleep. We probably can't be confident in that, because we really don't have enough people. We might only get a certain population of people, and that's not exactly what we want to do. So that, again, is going to be a big portion of what we're talking about. And many of you have probably understand this or have seen this reliability and validity chart before. So things that are reliable and not valid, things that are valid, not reliable, not valid, and reliable and valid. The idea here is that, this is reliable because we are getting the exact same results everywhere, This is also reliable because we're getting the same results, but this one's valid over here because we're actually hitting the mark. Here we're not. This one we would call valid because it did hit the mark once, but that doesn't exactly mean, and we should also say that it is hitting all the parts of the mark at some point, but it isn't doing it in any consistent pattern. So overall, recognizing, that doing a lot of this research involves a big back and forth between your validity and your reliability, and that includes both external and internal validity and kind of your reliability on your measures. So with that, my last slide for you is going to be some announcements. So make sure you complete that quiz again before the synchronous class session. Office hours are Tuesdays and Thursdays from 11:30 to 12:30. I do apologize. This lecture is probably a lot of material that you already know, but starting next week, we're really going to be digging into Chapter 3, discussing a lot about what it means to have a self and understanding what that is, how we use it, and how it actually impacts our understanding of the world around us. So with that, if you have any questions, shoot me an email. You can write your questions at the end of the quiz on that ungraded question as well. Come to office hours, whatever you need. But other than that, have a great day, and look forward to seeing you in class.